Okay, so as I mentioned in the last few lectures that we were going to be starting to talk about coral reefs. And I just want you to look at this picture for a second. It's a Pacific coral reef, which is very different than Atlantic coral reefs because, once again, the Pacific Ocean is older. The organisms have had a greater opportunity to evolve to their habitats. But there's not one area on this reef that would be considered dead or threatened or anything close to that. This is a reef just off the northern islands of Hawaii. And based on the water current flow patterns there and the species diversity there, it is one of the most biodiverse habitats on the planet. Everything you see in this picture is alive beside the water. Now that's not true of reefs elsewhere around the world. Many of the reefs around the world are threatened, and I've spent a lot of time in the Caribbean studying coral reefs and in Florida and the Keys, and I've worked with some fairly old coral biologists who kind of sit back and say, gosh, you're never going to really see a true healthy coral reef in the Atlantic at least. And it's shocking to me, I think, because these habitats are very important to the world. Recently, there's been a bleaching event that's taken place on the Great Barrier Reef and throughout the Indo-Pacific that has had a major effect on many of the species associated with the Great Barrier Reef and the corals that are on it. So we're going to talk in general about what makes up corals, where they're found, and some of their basic ecology. Now, if we look at how much of the planet they actually take up, they take up around 0.17% of our planet, which is not a lot. That's a very small amount, but they do hold approximately 4 to 5 of all the species, 4 to 5% of all the species that we have on our planet. Hence, coral reefs are very biodiverse. It comes out to like 91,000 species, which is huge amount of species. So even though they're small in size, they offer a great deal of habitat for many different species. Additionally, they act as carbon sinks. And the carbon sinks, because corals have a calcium carbonate skeleton, they're constantly pulling atmospheric CO2 into their skeletons. Hence, they act as a big carbon sink, which helps the global climate, which helps many of the different aspects associated with climate change. So we need these organisms on our planet to continue to do that. They're very productive systems. If you remember, they have living within them the unicellular dinoflagellate, known as zooxanthellae. There's around 13 different clades of different species of zooxanthellae now, which is kind of brand new in the last 20 years. Prior to that, they believed there was just one species, which is kind of unique. And it is these corals that produce these biogenic structures, which are basically the 3D structures that you see there that allow organisms to survive on the reef. So we're going to be talking more specifically about the phylum Cnidaria, class Anthozoa, and the order Scleractinia. Now, where are they found in the tropics? Well, within the 20-degree Celsius isotherm, which is usually between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. And if you look at this map, you can see there's a band of areas there right along the equator, just 30 degrees north and south of that coral reefs can survive and survive quite well. They're found all over the planet. Now, that doesn't mean that corals are just found in the tropics. There is a coral off the coast of Long Island. It's a Scleractinia, and it's called Astrangia poculata. I think it's named correctly. When they found it, they called it Madriopora, and then someone changed its name to say Astrangia because, it's a strange place to find a hard coral. And it just is it's a temperate coral. There are temperate reefs around the world that are not shown here. What is shown here are just tropical reefs. Now, when you look at the biodiversity associated with coral reefs, in the Pacific, there's thousands of different genera of corals. So to go study corals in the Pacific would be a massive undertaking because you would just have to learn so many different species. Whereas in the Atlantic, there's only 36 genera. I taught a coral reef biology course some years back for Northeastern University in Jamaica, and yep, we had to go out and give them their final field test, which was held entirely underwater, and they would, literally scuba dive along a transect line, and they would have to stop at the questions that were marked with red flagging tape, and they would have to read the question and identify the corals. And we got to actually get to all the 36 genera, which were pretty good. Then you have like other areas around the world, like the Red Sea, that have a lesser amount of species. And then you have unique like areas like Bermuda, where Bermuda is semi-tropical because it does get kind of cold there in the winter, 40s or so. But the coral reefs there are, not very high in biodiversity. They're actually kind of low, maybe 3 or 4 different species tops. But what you see here in this picture is a Pacific reef. And again, there's not one area of dead reef in that picture. I mean, that's absolutely gorgeous picture. Now, there are factors that affect corals. This makes an excellent question on an exam. They like to be at an optimal temperature of 23 to 25 degrees Celsius. Their depth is usually 25 meters up to 50 to 70 meters. Anything deeper than that, then they can't photosynthesize too well. Anything more shallow than that, then they might be affected by waves and storms, etc. They like 1 to 2% of light intensity, and a salinity that's almost entirely oceanographic, though you can find corals in estuaries, hence the coral I mentioned, strange oboculata, in the last slide. They don't like sediment falling on them because the sediment is just brought up from sand and dirt that's on the substrate that gets, blocks their mouths. It would be like me pouring dirt into your mouth every time you decided to eat dinner. It's not a good thing to have, so that affects them. And sometimes they can be emerged, which means the tides go out and the corals are intertidal. That's a relatively recent phenomena in New England for this coral that lives here, but it's not uncommon for corals throughout Indonesia. So if we look at the basic anatomy of a coral polyp, you can see the tentacles that are used to capture prey. There's a mouth that also acts as the anus. The mouth leads to the pharynx, which leads to the gastrodermal or the mesenterial filaments, which are those kind of like spaghetti-like filaments in there, where a lot of digestion takes place. Then the nutrients get absorbed through the gastrodermis, and underneath that is the sclerosepta, which sits on top of the skeleton. Now, within the gastroderm of the coral lives the zooxanthellae. That's the unicellular dinoflagellates that photosynthesize. So there's a thin layer of living tissue over a skeleton, which makes corals fragile. They can easily be damaged just by touching one of their tentacles because you're pushing a bunch of fleshy material against a hard skeleton. Now, one of the most unique aspects associated with corals is we don't know what the individual is when you study a coral. So what you see here is a species, Dendrodryra, and it looks like it's a whole bunch of different ones, but these are all genetically identical to one another. Hence, they could be considered one single colony. That's one of the biggest debates in coral biology right now is who's the individual? Is it one of those, all of those, or even more confusing, is it just one polyp that makes them up? So you have that question. The corals do have polyps that extend out and they capture prey. But remember, they're sessile organisms, so they don't move around a lot. So they have to capture prey from their water flow that goes over them. And hence the discussion of water flow and the no-slip condition and diffusional boundary layers and momentum boundary layers that we had for the last exam. So what we don't really know in coral biology, like I mentioned, is who's the individual. Is it the entire colony that we should be looking at as an individual, or is it that self-replicating polyp that just captures, prey on its own and feeds its own little skeletal area? So it's still a big question in coral biology as far as what the individual is. Now, what makes these cnidarians? Well, what makes them cnidarians is the presence of those tiny little bumps that you see in this orange coral. Those tiny little bumps in the tentacles are called nematocysts. And if you look at basically just look at any coral polyp, you're going to see a feeding machine. Its whole job is to capture prey and bring prey to the mouth opening to eat the prey and digest it. So it is a voracious predator, but it doesn't move. So it's very selective on what flies by and what it wants to capture and what it wants to feed on. If you gave corals multiple options, they would actually choose higher protein prey over, just any old prey that they could capture. So it's the presence of that nematocyst that really make them, cnidarians. Now there are many different types of reefs that are out there. And if you look at this reef, this is called an atoll or a horseshoe-shaped reef. It's common in the Indo-Pacific, and it develops in very deep water to create these large lagoons. And so you see the forereef there, where you see some lush green vegetation, you see a beach, and on the leftmost side of that slide would be a very deep reef. Kind of goes all the way around. But then if you follow that beach, it kind of erodes here and there, and it gets a lot less lush. And that's toward the right side of the screen. But that's a very shallow forereef. So there's a lot of corals in that area that are blocking the waves from coming into the lagoon and doing damage on the land, which is also protected by the land mass itself. So when you have a lagoon, you have a forereef system and a back reef system, which are very different from one another. But this is the type of reef very common in the Indo-Pacific. And you have what's called a barrier reef. And barrier reefs or fringing reefs, they're common to a lot of different tropical seas. Perhaps the most famous one is the Great Barrier Reef. But there's also one off Belize in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's the second largest in the world. And Great Barrier Reefs, you have this, fringing kind of reef with lush vegetation all around. And then you can actually see in this picture the different colors that are in the water that represent the different marks or zonation patterns on reefs. So these tend to develop near continental land masses. The Great Barrier Reef is near Australia, and the Yucatan Peninsula is off of Central America. So these are not standalone reefs. These are reefs that are very close to shore. Now, Darwin hypothesized that this is what created reefs, was basically volcanic activity. So he hypothesized this way back in 1824. It's one of his first theories associated with science. So if you follow the schematic from left to right, you see a reef being formed. So you have rocky volcanic islet that's encircled by a fringing reef. The reef enlarges and the land sinks or sea level rises, and you end up with this circular coral reef. So this would be the atoll that allows for the forereef area and the back reef area. Now, like I mentioned, coral genera are found worldwide, and this is just an example of the lower part of this figure of all the different species that are present in different parts of the world. And you can see just how dominated the corals are in the Indo-Pacific in relation to the Atlantic. Even if you get around to the area of Hawaii, we're looking at maybe 20 to 30 species of corals, whereas in the Atlantic, you might get 20 to 30 tops. Then you get into the Indo-Pacific, and you can get 40, 50, 60, 70 different species of corals all interacting with one another. So reefs are beautiful. This is another Pacific reef that, wow, just look at all the life that's there. There's some top predators on reefs that tends to be very, common, and it's good to see those. When you don't see top predators on reefs, you know that maybe overfishing is taking place or some kind of anthropogenic activity is taking place that removes them. And, if you remove the top predator from the food chain, you're not going to end up with a very healthy food chain. So a lot of reefs are what's called the spur and buttress reefs. And if you look at what you see here, okay, what you see are spur and buttresses, which are the B's, okay. You see the B, if you follow B, and you see that repeating spur that goes all the way through that figure. And then in between those spurs, okay, are grooves, and those grooves are basically sand grooves. As those sand grooves approach the shallows, they become surge channels, because if you think about water flow going through a restricted area, it's going to start getting much faster. And then there's an algal ridge where it's really shallow, where the algae can grow. But these spur and buttress reefs are really common. In the room that you take the test in, the desks would be the buttresses, and the ground between the desks, those three big areas in that room, would be the spurs. And so you have water flow constantly moving between structures, which means there's a lot of turbulence, there's a lot of increase in speed, which allows sessile organisms like corals to feed. So this is a very common spur buttress reef. It's one of the most common things that you'll see if you ever visit reef systems. Now, if we look at a typical atoll or a reef with a back reef and a forereef, what you can see is if we start on the right-hand side of this figure and we leave the beach, usually you find a seagrass bed not far from shore for those tropical organisms that depend on seagrass. Then you find this reef flat area, which is also called the back reef. And you might find corals there, but they're not going to be large and huge. They're going to be relatively small. So you're going to find a lot of smaller critters living in those habitats that might not represent the critters out on the reef. And then you have the reef crest, which is what does a majority of the land protection for the beach and for that island. So the sea has to work itself over the reef crest, in order to get to the back reef. So storms and everything else that usually affects coral reef habitats break on this reef crest. And then as you go through into deeper habitats after the reef crest, you'll notice the first type of species that you find are heavy branching corals. And then as you get deeper, they lead into massive corals. And that kind of continues down and down. It doesn't make a lot of sense that you would have heavy branching corals living in the surf zone or where waves are going to break. But if you remember that lecture that I gave about hydrodynamics and flow and how water is different than a solid, things don't hide from flow. Remember, these are sessile organisms. They need the flow in order to capture prey. Without that constant flow, they're not going to be able to grow or feed or reproduce. This is a really good graph to understand and know, because it sets up a majority of the ecology associated with these reefs. What's happening right now on coral reefs throughout the Great Barrier Reef and the oceans is they're bleaching and dying. So think about what would happen to this reef crest if those heavy branching corals just die and go away. And you just have a nice smooth mound there for a reef crest instead of something that's all jaggedy. Well, the flow is going to move a lot more inland, and it's going to have much of a greater effect on the reef flat, which then will affect the beach and islands and just everything along the coast. One of those heavily branched species that are out there is called a Crocra palmata. And this is a Crocra palmata. It's known as a reef builder. This here is a semi-healthy looking coral, but you can notice the coral on the left-hand side is somewhat healthy. It's kind of mustardy in color. And the coral that's on the right-hand side is this, it's just covered by this microfilament algae. It's it's become substrate for other things to settle on. So you have these corals on reefs that are reef builders, okay? Because there's a lot of corals on reefs that don't necessarily build reefs, they just reside there. Another reef builder would be this Genjogyra, which just is monstrous in size. I've seen these around the size of, easily a telephone pole that just, the flow goes by it, you see all the tentacles moving. It's just a beautiful organism. And a lot of corals are phenotypically plastic. Phenotypic plasticity means that if you take a coral and you move it from one habitat to another, it's going to change its morphology. And what you see in this picture are two ecomorphs of Montastria cavernosa, which is a very common Atlantic coral. And if you look at the one on the left, that's the coral that you would see in shallow habitats. And if you look at it on the right, you can see that that's the deeper habitat coral. But the deeper habitat coral has larger polyps than the shallow habitat coral. Now, this is important because with global climate change, the idea is that things are going to get deeper and not more shallow. And so those organisms that live in the shallows might have to adapt to some kind of deeper morphology. And this is going to be something that happens to reefs probably around the world with global warming. If you did a reciprocal transplant, so if you took the shallow corals and transplanted some into the deeper areas, and the deeper corals and transplanted them into the shallow areas, you would find probably within 2 or 3 years a change in their polyp size. And the polyp size is just those circles there that are on the corals. So they are plastic in that they can modify their morphology based on environmental conditions. Now I'm going to show you a series of slides to demonstrate to you just how much a reef actually changes over time. And so what you see in this picture are quadrats, a photo quadrat. And this is just one other mechanism that you can use to go collect data. You don't have to bring the quadrat out and do the counts in general. You can just bring a photo quadrat, take a picture, bring it back to the lab, and analyze it there. But if you look at this, you can see a great deal of coral cover on the right-hand side. And then that gray area that's on the left and kind of a little bit in the middle, that's just bare substrate. There's not a whole lot of substrate, or things growing on that. But there are some corals on the left-hand side too. You can see the pencil-like coral, and you can see that one brain coral. So this is 1963. This is the same exact photo quadrat from 1965. And you can see the remnant of that pencil coral on the left and some of that brain coral that's there. And you can see that, well, there's a lot more coral, covering this habitat. So within 2 years, we went from a habitat with probably 60% coral cover to almost 80% coral cover in this photo. And then if we look at a few years later, you can see that that's, again, dropped back. And we're down to maybe 40% coral cover in this. These are the same exact photo quadrats that, have been used every single year. These studies have gone on since 1963, so they're in their 50-some-odd year, 53rd year or 55th year of research. I mean, that's just amazing that people have been monitoring coral reefs for that long. And in 1963, scuba was relatively new to science, so people didn't just, put gear on and go diving. They had to really learn and probably make their own gear in order to collect this data. But this is just an example of how reefs change during the course of 1 year, or in this case, 6 years. And this is that same thing 9 years later in 1971, where it's almost up to maybe 90% coral cover again. So again, a changing reef. Now, corals probably have one of the most interesting reproductive abilities. They reproduce in every single way. There is no reproductive strategy that's not used by a coral. They can do what's called brooding, where they brood a planular larvae, which is released from the mouth, and it kind of looks like a hot air balloon. And that planular larvae becomes sea, and then it slowly feels the bottom and tries to settle on the bottom, and then when it settles, it metamorphoses and becomes a coral. So they can brood their larvae asexually. They can also simply bud a new polyp, So if you look at all the polyps that you've seen on these different colonies, all they need to do is start pushing out a new polyp, which would be budding, which is also asexual reproduction. But corals also reproduce via sperm and egg. You could have one coral species that are both male and female that just release sperm and egg or produce larvae. You have some corals that are just males, some that are just females that have to broadcast spawn their sperm and eggs into the water column, where they fertilize the egg and then they become the larvae that you see in the sea, and they settle and grow. Think about the ecological positives associated with being able to reproduce in every single manner. I mean, just think about that. If humans could just bud a new human out, or just poof, there's a baby. Nothing else needed. Okay. One, you don't have to worry about finding mates. Two, you don't have to worry about anything, really. You can just reproduce and make sure your genes went on. The negative with asexual reproduction is that there's not a whole lot of diversity associated with those organisms. But corals just adopted a different ability to say, hey, I can produce sperm and egg and push those out, and then we have a lot of greater biodiversity within a population. You should be familiar with all the different methods upon which corals reproduce. Now, they also compete with one another. And when corals, you saw those pictures over that 9-year span via those photo quadrats, and you saw corals increase in size, decrease in size. When corals come up against one another, they actually compete. And they usually overgrow one another when they can, because they're all competing for light and space on the reef, and they, remember, have to photosynthesize because they have those unicellular dinoflagellates living in their gastrodome. And so corals can actually produce what's called sweeper tentacles. And these, I showed you the tentacles that some corals produce. They're full of nematocysts. But the sweeper tentacles actually are bigger tentacles that sweep along the barrier or the interaction between corals, killing off another coral colony. It doesn't kill the whole colony, but at least it makes the coral realize that, I'm getting hit by nematocysts the whole time. I'm going to back off a little bit and stop going in this direction. And there's been research that demonstrates when corals do come up against one another, both of them spend some energy producing sweeper tentacles, but then they spend time just slowly pushing growth into an opposite direction. These sweeper tentacles is just an example of them. You can see the normal tentacles are there, and then you can see the much longer sweeper tentacles that have the ability to kind of just reach over and tap whatever it is they're competing with for space. And this is just another example. This is that Montastria cavernosa, a live picture of it. And you can see the regular tentacles there around the polyps, and then you can see the sweeper tentacles that are produced just because of the presence of the other coral. So the coral has the ability to deduct that, something's going to compete with me, I better stop pushing energy to producing these sweeper tentacles in order to keep them at bay. Now there's another type of competition that's called aggression. And this is where corals don't produce sweeper tentacles. They basically go side by side with one another, and they produce allelochemicals, which are just chemicals to keep each other at bay. And what's unique about this is that what you see are two corals interacting with one another, and one coral using chemicals to kind of cause that scar. See that scar that's there on the other coral species. Now, that doesn't mean that this works all the time. What you see here is one coral species that's overtopping another coral species. And it probably will be successful eventually in just entirely covering that up. That coral species that's covered up won't be able to photosynthesize. It will bleach and die, creating basically bare habitat for the competitor to win out on. And if you look at the coral that's underneath that, the one that's just along the center, maybe from the top left corner to the bottom right corner, that's a large species. And so all it did was take a probably bare spot, a bare space within its own skeleton for the better competitor to come and settle, and then poof, time will tell, but these things are probably just going to get totally covered over. Now, many different things eat corals, from fish to starfish, and many, many, many different things, nudibranchs, you name it. But there is one famous starfish that does this, or sea star. I know they're not starfish. Everybody knows that. I don't know what the big to-do is about those words, but oh well. But this is called the acanthaster starfish. It's known as the crown of thorns starfish because if you look at the figure of it, it looks like a crown of thorns. And these are really common throughout the Indo-Pacific and throughout the Great Barrier Reef in particular, so much so that local schools would actually teach children how to snorkel probably by like the 2nd or 3rd grade. And they would have snorkeling parties to go and take the crown of thorns starfish away from the reefs. So, we were all in elementary school at one point and went on field trips. Imagine going to the beach, putting on snorkeling gear, and then just saying, okay, for every starfish you collect, we're going to give you a quarter or a dime or whatever it was. And it was one of the best, mechanisms upon acanthaster starfish control that ever existed. And they still have that there today. But today it's more like a whole town event where there'll be like acanthaster day and everyone will go out and just collect as many starfish as they can, and they'll just throw them on the beach and let them die because that's how big of a predator these are. Once these starfish get going around a coral reef, they can wipe a reef out in a relatively short period of time. Tons of fish also predate on corals. These are just some of the different ones. Don't worry about the species on these. Just know that there's many, many different fish that do this. Parrotfish in particular are just incredible predators. I put a YouTube video up there. Please watch the YouTube video. I remember one time watching a school of midnight blue parrotfish just swim by. It must have been like 2,000 of them. It was absolutely beautiful because you couldn't tell where the middle was because it was just constant movement. And they would sweep down on a reef and all you would hear is crunching. So they go up to the coral and based on the parrotfish's mouth, which is very beak-like, it can really put a lot of force down on corals and crunch them. And you can see them just sweeping along coral reefs, crunching, and then moving up and, swimming away, going to another reef patch. And I put this in too because for those of you who've never been diving on tropical reefs, there are some reefs out there that are just pests. Some critters out there. And this is called the bastard damselfish. And I put 2 YouTube videos there for that. But this damselfish has a job. Okay, its job is to maintain its territory. So there's territoriality associated with this damselfish, and it's this thicket of coral behind that you see. It looks like the yellow pencil coral. It's Acropora cervicornis, a very common coral throughout the Atlantic and Pacific, and it grows very quickly off that apical end that you see. There's the white tips. And if these damselfish colonize these areas and you swim near them, they come right out after you. Now they're only maybe the size of your palm, so they can't do a whole lot of damage to you. But these damselfish have figured out the best area to bite a human that has a regulator or a snorkel in their mouth, and that's the mouth. So a lot of times you have a mask on, you can't really see what's happening around your mouth. Your regulator's in, maybe, or your snorkel's there because you're, holding your breath or you're breathing out of a regulator using scuba. And your lips are kind of like way out there, because they're pressed against the snorkel or the regulator, and they're quite large. And these damselfish, this has happened to me hundreds of times in the Caribbean, where you're doing research underwater and you have to be still for a little while to watch what's taking place. And this damselfish would just come out of nowhere and take a huge chunk right out of your lip, and then like swim 2 feet in front of you, demonstrate that they're eating you by chewing on your lip, and you can't really catch them because they're way too fast. And just an interesting phenomenon of how fish are protecting their territory. But what this means is, when you have all those predators coming along, other fish species like the parrotfish species, this little damselfish can rush out, attack that school of fish, and keep them from eating this coral that's present. So there is a huge positive benefit of being in a habitat with a damselfish around you. Not so much for humans, though.